Morning, everyone. My name's Russ Purdy. I'm always super nervous whenever I get asked to speak anywhere. It doesn't matter if it's a large group or a small group. I'm a person in long-term recovery. I've struggled with lots of different things, and one of the things that always comes up whenever I get asked to do something like this is my imposter syndrome. I quite frequently ask myself, why am I here? Why am I being asked to speak? What do I have to contribute to these conversations? I get reminded by mentors and friends that based off of lived experience, both the dark and unhappy days, and also my time now working in the space, that I've seen a lot of interesting things and had the opportunity to walk into a lot of different doors and sit at different tables. So then I just have to ground myself and come back to this place. So if I start rambling, it's because I'm nervous. If I start looking off in the distance, it's because I'm second guessing myself. But I just like to say those things, in that spirit of connection and vulnerability. I also like to think about, what's the intention? Why would I be here? What's the importance of this, or what do I want to discuss? In chatting with some of the organizers and reflecting back on my own experience, I think it's best to probably touch on part of my own story. The details are unique to me, but again, I find working in the space of mental health and addiction, like that piece of connection and really humanizing things and being able to have that vulnerability is crucial. And then moving into, because it all intertwines, moving into my experience working in the field in different capacities on that continuum of care. Some people saw this slide as they were walking in, talking about my own story, and the reason that I bring this up. I had this progression in life, this progression of what I would call, I had a really happy childhood, I would think. I was born in Saskatchewan, but raised in Alberta in a rural or a suburb just outside of Edmonton with a high level of income and wealth. And my family wasn't one of those families, but my mom and dad worked really hard to provide us everything that we needed in life. I recognize that I had a lot of privilege in my upbringing and a lot of opportunities, and I was a really happy child. I look back on things now, and I struggled with a lot of insecurities in that environment, judgment, the societal norms, and all sorts of things. And it wasn't something that was discussed. The emotional awareness and education that I'm seeing nowadays in the way that things are talked about wasn't talked about back then. All of the men in my family, those role models that I had were from small town Saskatchewan, where, a lot of the language was boys don't cry. We're allowed to be happy or angry. That's really about it. And a lot of things were solved with aggression. And that was the environment that I grew up in. That was normal to me. And then as I started to grow up and move through elementary school and junior high and high school, one of the things that I realized is I always felt different. I was always searching for belonging, and so I wore different masks to fit in. I would be a class clown and a comedian so that people would like me and wouldn't pick on me. I guess also for context, as you can see, redhead, ginger child, middle child born on April Fools. So I was probably destined to end up with one of the isms, as my family likes to joke about now, that things are different. But I always felt like an outsider. I felt different and was constantly searching for a piece of identity. And I ended up finding that in athletics. One thing where I was good at, I excelled in, I felt comfortable in, it felt safe to me when I was out on the ice, and I was good at it. And to me, the way that I started to find value in myself is how I performed in those arenas, in those environments. And also the accolades that I got from, whether it be family members or other people, reinforced that idea that that was my value, which, whether it was the true reality or just the way that I perceived it, was really an unhealthy way for me to grow up, because I also didn't pay attention to my schooling. There was not a lot of focus put on that. I was a terrible student. I was, as they would say, rambunctious and full of energy, hard to handle, hard to manage. I remember lots of parent-teacher interviews where the teachers would tell my parents, your son probably has ADD and he should be medicated. And my dad's response would be, well, no, he's just a young boy. You got to run him for a little bit and then he'll sit down and he'll pay attention. But this narrative, this belief kept going throughout, all of my youth. And the other thing that was very unhealthy was growing up in dressing room cultures, not a place of acceptance and understanding, not a place of being able to talk about emotions. Again, in that environment, the only time that you're allowed to cry is, if you've lost a championship game or something of that nature. But outside of that, we treated each other poorly, a lot of dark humor and also treating individuals or members of the opposite sex like objects. Everything was a conquest. When I reflect back on it now, I'm really not proud of the way that I'd behaved as a young man, especially having a younger sister and some of the things that she said to me as I got into my recovery. When I started having some struggles and challenges, I think it was 14 years old, and I'd had the first, I would call it, real setback in my life, or something that was life altering, for somebody that put all of their identity into playing one sport. And I had a major knee injury. I broke my kneecap into 3 pieces and a whole lot of other damage within there. And I had a reconstructive surgery. And back then, it wasn't a very clean procedure. And I was told that I would never play the sport again that I loved so much and I found so much safety in. I would say that experience built a whole lot of resiliency in me, whether I believed it then or recognized it then. But, I worked really hard, got to a point where I was able to play the sport again at a high level that I loved. And I look back on it now, and is the reason that I did it because I love the sport, or is it because the only thing that brought me a sense of self, a sense of safety? But that was my first real challenge with adversity. And I got to a point where I got to experience playing junior hockey in Alberta and Saskatchewan. Again, that lifestyle was not a very healthy one. But throughout a lot of my youth, I was that kid that was terrified of my father. I was terrified of letting people down. I was always rooted in fear-based decisions, and I didn't drink or use drugs or any of those things up until I turned 17. And I had joined my first junior hockey team, and my parents had said, hey, you're hanging out with guys now that are 18 to 21 years old. You've been a really well-behaved kid. We're going to give you the go-ahead to do this. You're still under our roof, even though you're not legal in the province. It's okay. You go ahead. I'll never forget the first time that I went to one of those get-togethers and I got drunk. The sense of freedom, relief from anxieties, from fear, from social interactions and engagement, the fear of judgment from others, judgment of myself. It felt like freedom. And, it started out in that progression of, I would drink on weekends, but I would drink to that point of being blacked out, vomiting, all those kind of things, coming to in the bushes, in my underwear, passed out in somebody's hot tub, all sorts of things like that, which back then everybody just thought it was funny and we were all having a good time. And I'm really grateful that there weren't a lot of camera phones back then, because there would probably be a whole lot of pictures of me out on the internet. But as life progressed, I aged out of that, and it came to this point of I either grow up and I start doing something with my life. I was 21, or I had the opportunity to go to school and continue to play hockey. And also right at that point, this is probably one of the things that I still carry a lot of guilt and what I would say healthy shame within my story, was that I had a high school sweetheart that I didn't treat very well, that left Canada and would come back. And during that time, when I made the decision to go to school for the sole intention of having fun, getting drunk, playing hockey, not because I wanted to grow up or really do anything with that education, she let me know that she was pregnant. And she also let me know that she had no intention of getting rid of the child, and that she was going to give the child up for adoption. She was going to do it with an open adoption. And that if I wanted to, I could write letters, send pictures to the family that was adopting the child, so that when he turned 18, that if he asked, he could find out who his biological father was. I probably had a little bit of misguided advice from my father at the time. obviously from friends. I was very selfish, and I chose not to do any of those things. I chose just to shut her out from my life. Yeah, a very hard thing when I look back on it now and the way that I behaved. But then moving into college, I was having this conversation the other day, right before we were watching Rebecca's film that evening. I was that student that I was put on academic probation on and off constantly throughout my time in school because I wasn't there for the right reasons. I was taking sociology and business. I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. I'd watched my mother work really hard in the world of accounting and get to the top levels of her profession, and I'd watched my dad work in the auto industry for a very long time and do really well for himself. And at some point, my younger sister, who was smart, social, all the things that I wished I could be, responsible, completed her schooling, bought a house, started living life, and I started feeling pressures from my family of, your younger sister can do this, why can't you? That benchmarking. And so I dropped out of college. I had a semester left to finish a degree, and I said, I'm just going to quit and I'm going to go work in the auto world and start making money so that I can grow up and be an adult and all of these fun things and get all this responsibility. And during that time, from the ages of 21 right up to 24, my alcoholism started to progress further and further. I would drink more and more heavily on weekends, and then it would start to creep into the industry nights. I started dating an individual that was a hairdresser. Would be going out with her constantly, and then it started approaching into this area where a lot of the people that I was hanging out with, I saw them with these big handfuls of money, and I would start seeing these hand-to-hand engagements that they would have with other people in the bars. And I wasn't naive. I knew what was going on. And there was a level of excitement and a level of danger and all of these other things that I found intoxicating as well. And they seemed to like me because I came from a background of just showing people basic levels of respect, shaking hands, looking people in the eye. Also to that far extreme side of it of violence was an okay thing. So if somebody were to disrespect somebody, it was okay just to get into a physical altercation. And so then at the age of 24, after dropping out of college and working to purchase a house, I also purchased a motorcycle so I could hang out with these guys more and more. Started going out into different events and things like that. And it was the first time that I decided I would use a chemical drug. And in doing that, my thought process, because I'll never forget it, I was in Kelowna, and my thought process was, well, I've drank and there's not really been an issue. I still get up and I go to work. I got up and I went to school. I did all the things that I was supposed to do. I smoked weed from time to time, more so to excess. But nothing really came of it. So what's the harm in engaging in, the use of ecstasy or MDMA? That's not going to be a big issue. And the first time was a blast. I had a great time. Again, I felt all those feelings again the first time when I drank alcohol. The escape from reality, the escape from everything else, the escape from myself. But again, the progression started to happen more and more. It went from I used it that one time to then I would use it almost every weekend to then I would use it in isolation away from people to then I would make excuses on weekdays to not be going out anywhere and I would use again. And that's the thing that kept happening was as I found new substances, the progression would continue to go on. It was very quickly, just a year of using those chemicals. At 25 came and I found cocaine. I had a friend that found a bag on him when we were going for a trip snowboarding and said, I found this. And again, the thought process was very much the same, rationalizing and justifying. I've still been able to meet all these basic needs of my life. I'm paying my bills. I'm still getting up and going to work. I'm doing all these things. What's the harm in doing this? Everything else has been okay to this point, but not recognizing what I would call a normal thought pattern of this is normal people don't just pick up ecstasy and MDMA and do these things. They don't neglect basic responsibilities. I started cutting out key relationships in my life. I've had a group of guys that I've grown up with since I was about 10 years old, and I'm 40 now, that we were best friends based off of, a sport that we played in common interests and likes, even though we're all very different. But I started to exclude them from my life because they didn't engage in these behaviors, nor did they condone it. I started distancing myself from my family because, the morals and principles that I was raised with, the behaviors that I was engaging with didn't align with those things. And even though I was feeling a sense of shame about how I behaved, I didn't want to be around them because I didn't want them to know. But I refused to identify those things and look at them. I just preferred to engage in these behaviors that made me feel comfortable or numb me truly from reality and everything else. And that first time that I used cocaine that was it. That was my love. And I've had friends ask me, did you ever use opiates, fentanyl, heroin, things like that? I like to go fast. Like that's the thing that I enjoy. And I still remember the two surgeries that I've had, morphine, Demerol, all those things. Yeah, they felt great, but taking that stimulant, that sense of, that euphoric feeling, I am Superman, I am invincible, all of those things that ever consuming, that was it for me. And once that happened, all bets were off. Because I also went from, I had bought a house, I think I was 24, turning 25. I was making way too much money in the auto industry as a young man and no responsibilities and nobody to provide any real supervision. And I say that and I kind of laugh at myself at 24, 25 that should I have had supervision? Did I need to have those things if I was maturing and progressing in a better fashion than what I did? But really quickly, life got very dark. Throughout all of my addiction, I remained employed. I actually continued to get advancements in the field that I was working in. The one thing that, I joke about now, I make a lot of jokes at my own expense about recovery, and a lot of the people that I'm friends with that are in that space, we reflect back on it now and we can have some humor with it. But it's also a good reminder of how dark things got. But I needed that money to fuel my drug habit. So I needed to hustle. I needed to show up. I needed to do these things. Though quickly, I was decompensating in so many different ways, physically, mentally, emotionally, all of that. And during this time, I think I was around 26. I'd had this really unhealthy relationship with my dad. I viewed him as my hero. I wanted him to be my friend. I wanted all these things. And it created this really unhealthy, tethering to him. And then my dad, and I've already discussed with him what I share and express in these stories. And so he's been okay with this, but my dad made the decision to cheat on my mom and leave my mom, and made the decision to tell me and not tell my siblings, not talk to a therapist, not do any of these things, because he also started to engage in this really unhealthy power dynamic in our relationship. So I was 26 years old. My parents would continue to put on these false family dinners and have everybody come over and put on the facade, and I would be there and I would witness them engaging with one another, see my brother and sister not know anything that was going on and their partners that were there, and I would be sitting there holding onto this lie. And rather than speaking up and saying, this hurts me, I don't feel good, what I decided to do is I used it as fuel to go further down into, self-harming behaviors, numbing behaviors, and then use it as a leverage point against my father to manipulate him out of money and resources to continue to fuel my drug addiction. At one point, I moved back in with my mother to be a support for her once my siblings found out about the separation and the divorce. And rather than being there to be a good son and to support her during these times, I again just used it as a time to manipulate her and take advantage of her when she was emotionally distraught and weak, financially, for a space to live rent-free, rent out my house so I had another source of income so that I could continue to buy drugs. Like all of these things, I've done a lot of work on the shame on it, so there's still a lot of guilt centered around those behaviors. And then at some point, my mother started to figure out what was going on, and she told me that I could no longer live with her. It was the first time that my mom really started to set a boundary, which I was very proud of her for. Looking back on it now, back then I wasn't proud. I was very angry. But so I had to go back to my house, and I had to get roommates. I had to have people living with me, which was not a good thing, because outside of like a social setting, and the only social setting I was going to was work. In my house, it was chaos. Things were disheveled, they were messy. I was unpredictable. I was aggressive. I had major mood swings, all sorts of things going on. And it got to a point, the picture in the middle, that was still in the fun times, I would say. That was before everything got really dark. And at the advice of one of my mentors and somebody that I work with now, they had said to me when I started working in the field, they said, I've gone through your social media and there's a lot of things on there that you should probably take down. If you want to start stepping into these spaces and being able to have these conversations, if we start working with government agencies and things like that, you're going to want to remove those things. So I was searching through all of the history of my stuff, trying to find something that had the right depiction of like where it really got to, and I couldn't find it. And unfortunate, also not so unfortunate. I also reached out to the treatment center that I went to and said, hey, could you send me my intake photo? And they sent me back all the privacy information that I would have to fill out before I could get that information back. And I'm like, I don't have time for this because I wait to the last minute to put things together. So I apologize for that as well. But, those years from 26 to 29, the income that I was making was not enough for the behavior that I was engaging. By 26, I was using on average 6 grams of cocaine a day, which is not a small amount, and it's quite costly. I was probably making close to about $120,000 a year. I was not paying my mortgage. I was not paying any of my bills. I was still manipulating my mother and father out of money to make those payments. And then I got to the point where I started engaging in criminal behaviors to fund my addiction. And from the way that I was raised to how quickly things progressed in the behaviors that I got into, I was speaking with one of the faculty members about this, Neil, in talking about some of the things, and I don't ever like to tell war stories or glamorize it because it wasn't any of that. Like it was hardship. It was awful. I had a quick stint of trying to be a drug dealer. Didn't go very well because I used more of the drugs than I actually sold, which then ended up in different repercussions with the people that were supplying me with the drugs. I turned my house into a stash house where I would have, money, guns, drugs, all sorts of things within it, which also put me in a lot of jeopardy. And I had a lot of run-ins with law enforcement where Neil made the comment, he said, man, you're lucky. And on one hand, yes, like there was some luck in my life where I should have ended up inside of the institutions that I now walk into to provide support to people and get to walk out freely. But also I recognize that there was a lot of privilege. A middle-aged white guy, I get pulled over in a vehicle that's got no insurance, no registration, all the papers are out. I was intoxicated and I had drugs on me in the middle of winter. And the nice officer said, hey, it sounds like you're doing the right thing by driving your drunk girlfriend's vehicle home. So I'm just going to let you drive home. I've already radioed ahead so that nobody pulls you over. Situations like that had happened where I should have been arrested. There was one intervention or pseudo intervention in my life where I had my brother-in-law's little brother living with me, and he found some of these things that were in my house, and he told my sister. They told my parents. I caught wind of it, and so when my house was empty, I had some associates go in there and clear everything out. And then ended up going to my house, and I had all my family there, and they wanted to have this conversation, but it really wasn't much of a conversation because it was more so my dad lecturing me, just saying, you need to do this, you need to go back to the gym, you need to get back to work, you need to do these things, and da 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 da. And my response was, hey, like, thanks for the conversation, Dad. Really appreciated that. Get out of my house. I'm okay. But I also realized that, the walls were closing in terms of like I was running out of resources to continue to live this life. So I did make a bit of a concession, that master manipulator. And I said to my family, like, I'll prove to you that I'm not a drug addict or an alcoholic. I'll start going to AA and NA for a year and I won't use. I'll show you. And my mother, my father, and my siblings were like, hey, this is great. This is a great step. So they got me connected with somebody, in the auto world in Alberta, there's lots of drug addicts and alcoholics, at least back when I was working in it. So they connected me with somebody and I started going to meetings in my hometown. But I would use in the parking lot before the meeting. The meeting was usually an hour and a half. I would use when they would stop for a smoke break. And then I would use immediately at the end of the meeting in the parking lot. And I would lie the entire time. I would take the tags or the coins And, in the rooms of 12-step fellowships, they call it taking dirty time. So I would do that time and time again on those milestone markers. And I would invite my mom to come to those meetings, or when you got those tags, sometimes they would ask you to speak. But I also, while I was there, I didn't do any of the suggestions that they had. The 90 meetings in 90 days, getting a sponsor, doing the steps, any of those things, really making a new network of people and connecting. Because all I would do is, by that point, I had nobody else living in my house. It was just me, and I would just be isolated in my basement with a plate of drugs in front of me at the end of every day. When I would come home from work, the drug dealer would be sitting out behind my house, just clockwork. Middle of the day, they would show up to the dealership, clockwork. Everything was routine at that point. My brain was so much in a place of, even if I had it, the only thing that I was thinking about, when am I going to get the next bag? Because I know that I'm going to run out of this. Constantly searching for that. And every time I used, there was never that same euphoric feeling of the first time that I'd used, which I was constantly searching for. I never got that same relief. And I got to the point where I was actually using just to feel normal. Because if I didn't have it, the depression spirals and everything else that would come up, I couldn't operate. I couldn't be around people. And I'll never forget, after that year, I was close to 28. My family took me out for dinner. And that master manipulator, I'd heard enough things in the room where they talked about real alcoholics don't leave the heel of the glass. Like, they finish that. The joke that they always talk about is like, that's alcohol abuse, leaving that. So I go out for dinner, I order a glass of wine, and my family says to me, like, are you sure you want to do that? I'm like, yeah, like, I'm okay. Like, I've done this for a year. So I drink the glass of wine very strategically to the point where I leave the heel of the glass. And my mom says to me, don't you want to finish that? I said, no, I don't need it. I knew I also had a whole bunch of drugs in my car that I was going out to immediately to use. But at 29, turning 30, it was very apparent to family members and friends that I was still engaged in all this, and I was shut out. My mom didn't want me around her. My brother didn't want me around him, his wife, and his daughters. I didn't want to be around anybody, only if I had to be. Every relationship that I had was transactional at that point. And it was the Christmas of 2016 where it was kind of a breaking point for me. My mom had finally invited me over for Christmas again, said that my brother and my sister-in-law and my nieces were going to be there. And so I said, sure, like, I'd love to be there. And I told myself all day, only use this much, try to be normal. This is an opportunity to get connection back. And I used all day because I couldn't control myself. I was flailing around. I was quite sketchy, is the language that my brother uses. And I get to my mom's place for Christmas, and I'm in and out of the bathroom probably about, I would say, at least 15 times in the span of maybe an hour, because I'm going in there and using and coming back out, and I'm all over the place scaring my nieces, until finally my brother says something and I have a big freak out and I say, I've got to leave. I can't be here. I got to go. I think what they told me that I said is that I have to go to a meeting. So I leave. I drove to a place downtown in Edmonton where I know there was a meeting, and I wasn't going for that. I was just waiting for another drug dealer to come and meet me. And then I vanished for a couple of days, shut my phone off, disappeared. I don't remember much of it. But I came to, I was in my house, don't know how I got there. And that had happened lots of times in my life. And I remember it's like, I got to go to work. And at this point I was working in Fort Saskatchewan. So I had driven down the Yellowhead. I had exited, like, I'll remember this plain as day for the rest of my life, but driving down the Yellowhead right near Sherwood Park, exiting off on this divided highway, middle of winter, snowy road. And as I'm driving down this divided highway, I unbuckled my seatbelt, because prior to this, I'd thought about ending my life a lot of times, because I recognized there was so much pain, but I just didn't know how to change it. I didn't know that there was an option. With the individuals that I was associated with and things that in my house, like, there was lots of different ways that I thought about doing it. Lots of times where, in using cocaine, my heart felt like it was out of rhythm, and I would have 911 dialed on my phone, and I'd be sitting there looking at it, having that discussion with myself of, why don't I just let it go? Just use a little bit more and let it end. But on this drive, snow was falling everywhere. I unbuckled my seatbelt and I got two hands on the steering wheel, and all I was thinking is, how hard do I have to yank this thing to roll this car and kill me? My family doesn't have to hurt anymore. I don't have to hurt anymore. All of this can just end. Instead, what I did, and I still don't know why I did it, but I pulled over and I called an old teammate that I had in college and I told him everything. Told him about the drug use, told him about the illegal behaviors. I told him about the pain, the shame, the fact that I just felt like I couldn't do it anymore. And I didn't know how to stop, and I didn't know what the next right thing to do was. And his response was, what the hell do you want me to do with this? I don't know how to help you. And then he asked if he could call my family. I said, yeah, sure. Like at this point, like I've given up. It was either this, like truly ask for help, because the first time that I had asked for help, this was years ago. Years prior to that, I think I'd asked for help and I said, I think I need treatment. And my dad laughed at me. So that's not really a thing. So he called my sister. My sister called my mom. My mom called her sisters. And her sisters at this point were living in the States and living in BC. And so they started doing a whole bunch of research on treatment centers. Again, reflecting back on that privilege in my story, my parents had gotten to a point financially where, regardless of how challenging it is to navigate the system, they could make a phone call to a treatment center and say, I could be there tomorrow. That was an opportunity for me. And so I got a message from my sister and she said, hey, mom's going to send you a text. There's 6 treatment centers. We've done the research. You pick which one you want to go to and they'll fly you there tomorrow. And this was on a Friday. And so I called all 6. And I had one that told me that they had a pool. I had another one that talked about how I got to keep my laptop. And it's like, I didn't have a laptop because I had sold it to keep getting high. I had one where I went to a voicemail and I talked to one that sounded very militant, but there was one that I called on Vancouver Island where the human being on the other end of the phone just connected with me. Said, I know what you're going through because I've been there. Told me a little bit about their story. And told me that I don't have to live my life that way anymore, that there is a different way, and it's going to take a lot of work. But if I'm willing to do it, then they're willing to help. And then also said, between now and if you do decide to come, here's my cell phone number. Call me, text me whenever you want. The only reason I won't answer is because I'm probably sleeping, but outside of that, like I'll be there to support you. And for the first time in a long time, I felt heard, I felt seen, I felt, regardless of whether it was true or not, but I felt like I was being treated like a human being. And so I said, yeah, sure, I'll be there. And they asked, when could I be there? This was on a Friday. I said, I can fly out tomorrow. And they said, hey, respectfully, we don't do admissions on weekends. Like we don't have the staff for it. And I said, I can be there Monday. And, reflecting back on it now, after operating treatment facilities, I know more. But he said, hey, like we can't do it on Monday because I had to talk to my employer because I was still working at this time. He's like, so we'll see you Tuesday. And I'm like, okay, sounds good. What he also said was, between now and then, Russell, please don't die. What my addict brain told me was, you just told me I can use drugs as long as I do it safely. And he said, well, if you're anything like me, I know what you're going to do, kind of that last hurrah. And I've had that conversation a lot with individuals on the phone before they're coming to treatment. So I called my family. I said, hey, I'm going to treatment. This is where I'm going on this day. And they said, why not Saturday? And I gave them the whole spiel. And I also said, and the guy told me that I could use drugs up until I get there. And my mom's like, I'm pretty sure that's not what he said. I'm like, that's exactly what he said. Yeah, but I have to do it safely. So here's the plan. There's a whole bunch of stuff that has to get out of my house, and there's people that got to come get that, and I can't have any of you around for that. So I'm going to need the next few hours to get my house cleared out. And then what we'll do is if we do a rotation between you, Dad, my brother, my sister was out of the province at that time, but you guys will just rotate through doing shifts upstairs. Don't come downstairs. Whatever you do, do not come downstairs because you don't want to see it. You don't want to experience it. But I'll send you a text. I'll send an alarm on my phone, and I'll text you every hour and a half. If I don't text, call 911. So then for the next 3 days, I put my family through hell because that's the process that we engage in. And throughout all this, I also, I was reflecting on it with you, Rebecca, about some of the behaviors. One of the characters in the movie that I saw last night, like that, the toxic behavior for men. I continued to date people and harm people and treat people like objects, utilize them for my own pleasure. I was dating somebody 10 years younger than me at the time. I was 30 years old going into treatment. I was a It was a psychological and emotional battlefield, and I was taking no prisoners. And on my way to treatment, it was January 3rd of 2017. My dad had to accompany me because everybody thought that I was a flight risk. And so we flew out to the island, drove up there, and as we were doing the admission, I'll never forget my dad takes my ID, takes my credit card, takes my debit card. None of that mattered because I had no money left and I couldn't run away regardless. And I was also at a point of just complete defeat. I'm like, I'm ready. And he left, said bye, walked away. I did my admission. They put me to bed. And I was terrified. I was 30 years old in an addiction treatment center, and the campus held 54 people at the time. I remember waking up the next day, and it was a support staff. And I also laugh about this, but treatment in 2017, there was maybe a couple differences in how we approach things now. But they woke me up and they said, "Hey, it's time for breakfast. Go down to the dining hall." And I said, I'm not feeling very good, really, truly. Like I was just full of anxiety and I was terrified of the place that I was in because I had no experience with treatment or rehab. I'd only seen it on movies. And his response was, "You're a stimulant addict. You've slept for this long. Time to get up, time to go. Like there's no questions here." I'm like, okay. I was in treatment for 52 days in an inpatient treatment center. I had struggles in the first 2 weeks, but I think one of the things that served me very well is the time that I spent playing sports and in those structured environments and understanding why you had professionals telling you what to do and finding the value in that. I also had a really good counselor who called me out on a lot of things, didn't pull very many punches, told me that I was a selfish, self-centered, spoiled, entitled brat in group. And I said to him, "You can't talk to me like that. I've paid a lot of money to be here." And he said, "You haven't paid shit. Your mom and dad did. So I'll talk to you however I like." And I said, "I'm going to call my mom after this." 30 years old, said, "I'm going to call my mommy." And he said, "Great, we'll do it together." And we did. And he called my mom and I said, "Mom, Joe said this." And she said, "He's right." And then hung up the phone. And again, it was one of those that was in the first 2 weeks. It was one of those realizations of, one, mom is doing work on herself, obviously. That is truthful. And I'm like, this is not going to be an easy process. And I also had some struggles with like the treatment center that I went to, very disease-centered focused, where it was education, skill sets and skill groups, group therapy, some individual therapy. But they also reflected back a lot on what's going to be the best thing to connect you to in community if you don't have access to psychiatrists, therapists, psychologists, these kind of things. So there was some 12-step components brought into it. And I hated the word God on the walls. Like I grew up in a Roman Catholic household, and my view on God was that he was an angry guy in the sky with a magnifying glass and would burn you like an ant when you did something wrong, and there was no coming back from it. So I had a really big distaste for it. And it was funny, one of the guys that I had as a roommate who was actually on bail to be in treatment said to me, he's like, "You need to get out of your own way." He's like, "It's just a word." He goes, "All you're trying to be taught is that there's something greater than you out there. Like you are not the be all end all. Stop being so selfish and try something really simple. At the beginning of the day, ask for help. And at the end of the day, say thank you. Start that simply." Still to this day, I'm a little over 9 years now into my recovery, and I've got I would say that I'm spiritual. I'm not religious. I have a connection with a higher power. And somebody asked me about it, and I was describing, one of my grandfathers that is no longer with us, a very strong-willed individual that lived his life by certain principles. Your last name is not only yours, it's your family's, and your word is your bond. And so if you say you're going to do something, you better do it. And you treat people with a level of respect and decency and kindness. That is my idea of a higher power. Those are the things that I strive to live towards. But in treatment, I learned all these interesting things. I learned that people can be liars and manipulative, and they can be really good at it. I learned that I'm very sensitive. I learned, through poetry therapy that I love to write, and I'm a pretty good poet. I learned that I'm not a really good artist because art therapy was never something that I enjoyed. But I learned all of these things, and constantly throughout the challenges, it was just that piece of I needed to heal, and it wasn't so much the drugs, it was me. I had insecurities and all these things that I never talked about, that I never wanted to look at, and I never wanted to address. And one of the other things that they recommended that I do was go to a recovery house that I was really resistant to. Because I had said, I'm 30 years old, I'm an adult, I still have a job, I'm going to go back to that, I'm going to be responsible in all of these things. And the care providers there said, you have no idea how to live life. This is 52 days. You don't know how to act and live like an adult. I had the emotional maturity of a 16, 17-year-old. So they recommended that I go to a recovery house, and I at first said no, and then my family said either you do it or you're out on your own. By the way, you haven't been making your mortgage payment, so it's not your house, it's ours at this point. So you'll be homeless. And so based out of fear, I said, yes, I'll go. And I went to that recovery house thinking I'd be there for 30 days, and the recovery house was in South Surrey. And I also thought, who goes to Surrey to get sober? Yeah, have you been there? And I ended up staying for 5 months. It was a place where I learned to have a relationship with myself. I learned how to have a relationship with other men and be supported. I learned how to, really hone in that picker of who's a good human being and who do I want in my social circle, because I got to choose that now. A big thing through my journey in recovery is I learned that, the world is not happening to me. The world is happening around me. And the only thing that I have control over anymore is, do I react or do I respond? Do I take time before I lash out on things? And how do I show up? And so in those 5 months, I made the decision I wasn't going to move back to Alberta. I'd made the vow that I would never go back to Alberta because all of the bad things that I'd done were in that province, in the city of Edmonton and Calgary, that I would move to BC. I'd stay there. I moved only about 15 minutes away from that recovery house. I continued to go back. I would sponsor guys. I would do step work with them. I would take them out to meetings, take them out for coffee. I would engage in all these, different activities that we would do, just be a good alumni member. I'd go to the treatment center and do panels, speak about my own experience. And then just over the 2-year mark in my recovery, this is right around 2019, the managing director of the treatment center messaged me one day and he said, hey, I want to buy a car and I want to talk to you about it. And I'm like, I don't sell cars. So you don't want to talk to me. He goes, regardless, I still want to sit down and have lunch with you. So I met with him and he said, I don't really want to buy a car. What I want to do is I just want to connect with you. And we started having this organic conversation and realized that, one, we grew up in the same circles. We knew a lot of the same people, stories fairly similar. And he said, I'd like to hire you. And I'm like, well, I'm not a counselor. I never even finished my degree. And I don't know what you'd want me for. He's like, in all honesty, he's like, I just want to hire you because you're a good human being. He's like, you get that piece of living in recovery. He goes, and I want to hire you to run the recovery houses that you once lived in. He's like, this, it's private, so there's a business aspect, and you get that. He goes, but just being a good human. He's like, we'll train you on all the other things. The clinical language, like all those, like the different components, we'll get you the support, we'll get you the training so that you can feel comfortable and confident. But you seem like you appear to be a good human and you're doing the right thing. So that's what I want to have with me. And he also told me I'm going to pay you way less money. So we're not doing it for the dollars. But the landscape of addiction treatment, of mental health is ever changing and ever evolving. And there's more and more research going into it like every year. And we don't know what it's going to look like in a few years. Like the path is unknown and this could be a ton of fun. And you're going to have way more satisfaction in what you do. I left that meeting and it was probably a couple hours. I called my sponsor, I called my mom, and I said, this is an opportunity. And both of them said very much the same thing. It's like, you've made lots of decisions based off of financial means. And one of the reasons I had to do that is, I neglected to say this, my mother, the lovely accountant, when I was making amends to her, and I said, I know that I've manipulated you out of a lot of money. So when I was making that amends, I had a couple $1,000s to give to her. And I said, I don't know how much, but hopefully here's a start. And she said, would you like to know? Because I've got a spreadsheet. I was like, okay. And it was closer to the tune of $83,000 is what I had manipulated her out of and owed her. And that's not even including my father who just wrote it off. So for the first, the first year and a half of me working, it was just like I lived by very bare means and everything was going to my mom to try to pay her back. And she got to a point where she said, hey, we'll call it even. You put in a lot of hard work. I'm just happy that you're living this life. And so not having that component, I made the decision where it's like, I don't want to make decisions based off of the financial aspect of it. I've done that for a long time, and I also hate the industry that I work in. I hated the auto industry. Um, didn't like the people, didn't like the customers, didn't like any aspect of it. It was always just a battle. And I thought this would be a lot of fun. Like, I've got passion for this. Like, I feel like I have purpose. And reflecting back on it now, I have these conversations with that managing director is now one of my mentors. He was also at my wedding. He was a person that I stayed in the hotel room with him and wrote my vows the night before my wedding. We reflect back a lot on these small decisions that we've made in our life that have gotten us to where we are now. But the purpose, like that sense of hope and purpose in my recovery has been such a driving force. And I started working in the recovery house. I remember going to my boss and saying, hey, like, I'm leaving. Here's my notice, 2 months. I'm going to go work here. And he goes, what are they paying you? We'll match it or pay you more. I'm like, they're paying me less. He's like, you're insane. I'm like, yeah, I am. Probably. That's all good. I want to go do something and have fun. And so I ran those recovery houses for approximately 2 years. I just realized I got more slides. I also don't like to take myself very seriously, as you might see in some of these slides. But so I ran those recovery houses for 2 years, and part of that was also during the height of COVID, which is a super interesting time in the space of mental health addiction, whether you were private or public, and all of the challenges that came with it. All of those community resources that we would once access that you were cut off from, all of the 12-step meetings that were once there that were then cut off from, and having to go virtual with things, having to get creative to help support individuals. Proud to say that the treatment center that the recovery houses were affiliated with, we never had a COVID outbreak during our time of being employed there. We were like very cautious. I also think that Carson, who one of my mentors, wears a tinfoil hat most of the time and very conspiracy theorist, so he goes to the far extreme, but it was good. But I learned a lot in the 2 years of being there in terms of providing care. I got burnt a lot. I took this lens sometimes of like, I could be the driving force that helps this person stay in recovery. I'm responsible for these things. And I held on to people in certain situations for too long that caused toxicity and danger within the recovery houses, brought the community at jeopardy versus, the outcome for the individual. I learned that I don't have that kind of control and that kind of power. The decisions that somebody makes are not my responsibility. I can provide people with all of the information and all of the supports, and they're a human being, much like my life. The choices that were made were my choices. And those choices have consequences, can't be shielding people and protecting people from everything at all times, because that's also not reality. So the other interesting thing was during this time, they tell you, at least they told me in treatment, don't get into a relationship for 1 year, a romantic relationship, if you're not already engaged in one, because you need time to learn who you are and have that healthy relationship with yourself. So I didn't. I think I took 16 months away from dating, because I also got a lot of hard feedback from my sister that I was a womanizer and I didn't treat people well. And I wanted to be a better human being. I wanted to have some understanding around those things, what it meant to be in a real relationship and be a partner and have openness and communication and all of that. And then when I did start dating, it was really interesting that how quickly I could be like, this doesn't feel right. Your values don't align with my values, and no slight on you, but hey, enjoy the dinner. I'm paying the bill. And after that, I'm never going to talk to you again. No harm, no foul. And there was one night where I was out for dinner with my dad, and I ended up meeting this wonderful woman in that photo. My wife, funny enough, is a registered therapist now. That wasn't her intended goal when she was in school. She's much more educated than I am, smarter than I am, funnier than I am. I would say all those things. I'm punching outside of my weight classes, people tell me. But when I met her, I realized a bunch of different things. I already knew that I wanted to be better. And when I met her, I realized that I wanted to be truly a good man to her. I'd found somebody in my life, and I get emotional talking about it, because I'd also thought that I was never going to have a family. I was going to be that fun uncle when I did get sober and get into recovery. I'm going to be that fun uncle that travels the world and probably makes, I've got disposable income and I can buy my nieces and nephews things. because I was never going to find that level of happiness. And that all changed when I met Emily. And when I met her, I was also telling her, it was funny because somebody had asked me, it's like, well, how did you tell your wife that you like all these things from your past? Like, that's pretty dark. Maybe she liked the bad boy aspect of it all. And it was on our first date where I'd asked her, like, what do you want to do? Who do you want to be? Like, I don't want to waste time. Let's engage in these conversations. And she's like, I did my undergrad in neuroscience and I want to be a speech language pathologist. And I'm like, oh, you're super smart. She's like, what about you? I said, I'm a drug addict and alcoholic and I'm really working on myself, but I've got a job and I'm shifting careers and I'm going to work in this space and I've got no idea what's happening in my life. And she went, that's all super interesting. Thank you for being honest. And I said, you want to have a second date? She said, yes, I'd love to. And then it was just transparency and honesty. And, you know, I am not perfect, nor is she, but we're able to have real conversations. And, you know, I now have a beautiful family. I have twin boys that are just about, or they're a little over 2.5 now. Potty training is a nightmare. And they fight like cats and dogs. We've got a third child on the way, a little girl that's due in July. And my life feels so whole. And I think about those darkest points of where I was at, alone by myself in the basement, where I wanted it all to end, to where I am now and what things look like, and that hope and that growth and that opportunity and all these things. I think to all the people that I interact with and engage with, that whether it was in a treatment center or a recovery house or in the jails that I walk into, they all deserve that opportunity. They all have the potential to have those lives, to have that hope and the beautiful talents that they have. Like I tell them all the time, I get to go to conferences, I get to sit at tables with decision makers and policymakers, with government, with corrections, with all these things, and I am not anything special. Like there's nothing really special. Like I just showed up and I did the work. And I had bad days, and that's okay. I took accountability for things, and I just kept trying to do the next right thing. I had a lot of support along the way. Some people don't necessarily have that opportunity, but I think part of the role of providers is to connect people to those resources, to get those supports, to stay in contact, you know, to be a positive influence. On my journey, the treatment center that I worked for opened in partnership with the Saskatchewan government and St. Joseph's Hospital in Estevan, opened a treatment center, publicly funded treatment center with a private program for long-term stays. They asked me if I would go out there for a 3-week stint just to take an observation of how the program was running. I went out there, and 2 weeks of being out there, my boss came to me and said, hey, can you move here? Can you move here and run this program? And my imposter syndrome crept up. I'm like, I am not that guy. And he said, no, you are that guy. Like, this is your education. You will be okay here. You will do well here. We will support you. And then I also thought I was getting ready to propose to my then girlfriend, who's lived in New Westminster, BC, never spent a day of her life on the prairies. And I'm going to ask her to move to Estevan, Saskatchewan, which is the 6th largest city in Saskatchewan. That was one of the selling features that I gave her. I also told her, don't Google it because the pictures aren't great. And she said yes. And at the time she was shifting her focus from speech language pathology to a master's in counseling psychology. And so she thought this was a really interesting opportunity as well from an education standpoint and practicum. And when that program was initiated, it was 22 beds of inpatient treatment, 4 detox beds. And by the time we left 18 months later, it was 32 beds inpatient, 6 detox beds, and I think it was 24 sober living beds at the end of it. Like there was a lot of growth and a lot of good things were happening. But the interesting piece of going from BC to Saskatchewan, you know, large city to small city, was recognizing the lack of resources and the barriers and the challenges. Like in here, I'm going to talk about some of those, but which I'm sure we've all got awareness to. But one of the other things was, and I hope I don't offend anybody by saying this, but in a small town in a hospital where they see, as they call them, frequent flyers or repeat customers time and time again coming into Emerge and accessing resources, being prescribed different medications and basically stabilized and then sent out the door, knowing that they're going to see them in a couple days. The culture and the attitudes towards people that struggle with addiction or mental health was not one of acceptance, was not one of kindness or humanity. It was very much, this is a strain on our system. These people never get better. Why do they keep coming here? Find somewhere else for them to go. And then in comes bubbly Russ. And I get there. And, the director of the hospital lets me know, he's like, hey, like, you're going to have some challenges here. Culture shifts are not easy. Like, that's okay. I'll just be me. We'll see where it goes. And so I share my story very transparently and freely, especially in the spaces when I go in for any, working opportunity, because there's a lot of individuals, even in that space of providing care where you don't see the positives on the other side of it. You hear the worst of the worst, you see the worst of the worst, where if I can also be part of that representation of, hey, things do change, people do change, and I can also engage and treat these individuals that are in here in pain. I can treat them like a human. I can have the conversations. I can role model those behaviors. Starting to see nurses, doctors ask more questions, which is, to me, I'm appreciative of it. And I also think, that imposter syndrome I constantly touch on comes back. I'm like, I'm not a doctor. I'm not a psychiatrist or any of these things. Like, I am not classically trained in those. But what I am, I'm a human. And I'm a human that struggled with the disease of addiction. And I can talk about my experience. I can talk about, the impact of being treated like a number, whether it's your healthcare number or your ORCA number is for inmates in provincial jails. That's the number in Alberta. And I can talk about that. And I can also talk about these are the changes that have happened in my life based off of receiving good care from people. And it was really interesting not that long ago. I got to go to a recovery summit in Saskatchewan. And there was a group of alumni that are now working for that treatment center. So to see that come full circle where they're now working in the field, and I asked them, what are things like in the hospital? And I said, like, I've got friendships with some of those nurses that the one time that a couple times when I was dropped off there, didn't treat me too well, but now like they invite me over to their house, we have dinner, like we've actually got a relationship and these sorts of things. That really warms my heart. And again, during all this time, I'd said, I'm never going back to Alberta. I'm not going to do that because I just don't like it. It's triggering for me. It's all these things. There's been times where I've gone back and I've visited. How am I doing for time? Okay. Sorry, I ramble. I would go. What's that? Perfect. I'm not getting through all these slides. I would go back and visit, and I would run into old acquaintances. There was a time that I was out having dinner and a guy came up and he's like, Russ, don't you remember this? I'm with my dad. I'm like, hey man, I've got no idea who you are. Don't you remember that time at my house, the Hawaiian shirts, we rode a door down the stairs, crashed on the wall, all these kind of things? I'm like, no man, like I was blacked out for the majority of, this year to this year. I went to rehab. I don't know who you are. I'm really sorry. And there's also been some of those uncomfortable interactions where people from the criminal behaviors have seen me and we make eye contact and they nod and I nod and that's that. I'm not here for that. But I had colleagues and friends talking about the changes that were happening in Alberta. The investment that was being made by the government to support the treatment of substance use disorder, a new outlook on treatment centers being publicly funded so everybody had access to care, breaking down, a lot of the barriers. Like after being in the system, seeing the strains on the system. Being in BC, it wasn't that there was a lack of beds, it was a lack of access to beds because you had to pay $40,000 to get one. So Alberta made that commitment of we're going to build 11 recovery communities based off of a therapeutic community model, long-term stays. Individuals can be there for up to 1 year. The only requirement is that you're an Alberta resident. So 750 beds or approximately that to treat substance use disorder and provide that safety. There's a bunch of other investments that they're also putting within prevention for education in schools, because I remember if any of you had like the DARE program and things like that, this is your brain on drugs, but more awareness around like the emotional education components of those. I'll be very excited to see how that is further developed and what actually gets implemented in schools for children. I wish I would have had it looking back on it now. But as they talked about all this exciting stuff, and I just realized like here's an opportunity of change. An opportunity of change for, whether it be bias, stigma, the fact that, addiction and recovery doesn't have to be that dirty stepchild that's held in the darkness. It's going to be brought to the forefront. Recovery is going to be celebrated. It's going to be a big thing that's talked about. I made the decision that co-made the decision. I spoke with my wife. We found out that she was pregnant with our twins. And I said, hey, I know I said I never wanted to go there again, but this is everything that's happening and it's really cool. And I like the idea of publicly funded treatment. I like the idea of being able to connect with people and support change. What do you think? She said, sure, let's go. So we were lucky enough, reflecting back on the relationship that I had with my mom, that we moved to Alberta. We moved in with my mom, and she supported us and our boys in the early stages of their life. I got to open the first recovery community in Alberta in Red Deer. At the time, I was working for the Edgewood Health Network. And then I left that group and I went back to work with, one of my mentors, Dr. Carson McPherson and Dr. Paul Sobey, and a team of doctors that had started an organization. And the first thing that they put me on was part of they realized in Alberta they need to build a workforce. And how do we do that? We need to have different training programs. So they had a direct to learner, the Recovery Training Institute of Alberta, and then they also wanted to train recovery coaches to be out there supporting, whether they're support staffs, in the navigation centers that are now open, virtually, because we've got rural areas as well that people don't get access to care. Also just to help support people navigate our systems of care because they're super complex. So they said, can you build the first iteration of the Recovery Coach Academy? I'm like, nope, I don't build programs. That's not something that I do. Like, I'm an operations guy. And they said, well, that's what you're going to do. I'm like, damn it. I guess I don't get to say no. So I took a whole lot of trainings from US to out BC, like some even across the water in the UK, and built something. And it worked for a period of time. And then they said, hey, we would really like you to join like the corrections division of our organization. And I said, great, because I don't think I'm really good at this. And the person that they're putting in there to take over has done an incredible job, beautifully gifted mind, and he's the right person for that seat and has done phenomenal things. We laugh all the time when he talks about the first iteration was just garbage. I'm like, yeah, you can say that. I don't take any offense. But I got to step into the space in, where am I at here? Talk about that. Talk about this. The forward thought of supporting people. What I do now, I'm the executive director for Beccarian Correctional Care. Those are specialized units within 4 provincial correctional facilities in Alberta. 72 beds in total is what we have. And we call it a TLU, a therapeutic living unit. It's addiction treatment based off of an adapted therapeutic community model. Voluntary program. We invite individuals that are both sentenced and remand to come. So individuals can be there, provincially sentenced 2 years less a day. Remand, we just had somebody that was released and completed our program that was there for 396 days. A phased approach to the treatment process based off of, behavioral milestones, wanting to recognize from an individual perspective, who was this person when they first got to us and how are they progressing? It has components. I really like variety when it comes to programming. So psychoeducational lectures, DBT, CBT, also being able to engage people in whether it's AA, NA, well-variety, SMART, giving people the opportunity to experience lots of different pathways so that they can say that I really like this. This resonates with me. When I leave here, this is the group or the community that I'm going to connect with. Also being able to challenge norms in a correctional facility and saying, hey, yoga is a really therapeutic process. It's a really therapeutic thing to engage in. Can we bring yoga in? And they're like, what do you mean? I want to bring a yoga teacher into the jail, onto the unit, and facilitate yoga with all the men. They're like, corrections, is she going to wear Lululemon? No, I can ask her not to. Like, we can be very mindful of the area that we're in. And so we found this wonderful facilitator that runs the Prison Yoga Project. It's a program that was founded in San Quentin. So her and her team facilitate yoga weekly in all 4 of our therapeutic living units. The other interesting piece is that thought around the units operate separately from the rest of the jail. Our members, we don't call them inmates, we call them members. It's about humanizing the individual that's in there. They are not an ORCA number. They are not their last name. Our staff go by a first name, members go by a first name, correction staff also go by a first name, which is a big difference in facilities. And it's about humanizing everybody within there, that we don't engage with the rest of the GP units because the potential negative influences or relationships or all those kind of components that come into play, they're in there doing really hard work. I wish I would have put one of the schedules on the slides, but Monday through Friday, it's approximately 12 hours of scheduled interactions. And then on weekends, it's a little bit dialed back because we also, what I've experienced, others have experienced, is when you've got that downtime and you're left up here and you've been learning all these tools and skills and the voices start going on up here with the bad ideas and thoughts, what tools do you utilize? Who do you reach out to? There's other components in the model where, the role modeling behaviors, and we talk about feedback as a positive mechanism, where teaching people that feedback can be done in a really healthy way. It's not a weapon. That if I'm giving somebody feedback, I'm doing it from that lens of if they're doing something that's harmful to them or to the community, how do I bring that up in a healthy way? And we've got different progressive outcome tools that we can utilize within the space, push-ups and pull-ups for positive or not positive behavior, verbal versus written. If things progress further, we can get into things like mediations that might have to happen between two individuals or accountability groups for a single individual because it's causing some unrest within the community. But it's really been this piece of stepping into an environment where if you were to talk to, much like I have most corrections officers, they talk about corrections being a place of warehousing and containment, not a place of what I like to call restorative justice or rehabilitation. Because in provincial facilities, these people are coming out. They're coming out and they're coming back to community. And who's the individual that you want coming back? And also, how do you want them supported coming back? And furthermore to that, it's that idea of if addiction and substance use is prevalent in a space, why aren't we going there? Why are we waiting for an individual to be released before we'll give them care and provide them that support? More than likely they're there because of crimes of despair or crimes related to substance use disorder. God knows I should have been there. So why don't we go in there and provide that support? That was the forward thought of, Alberta government, like our team put some things together to bring forward and said, we can go in there and we can do this. And it can be a lot of fun. Now, corrections, it took some time for officers to get used to this idea and to get them engaged. But we've also gone to a point where now federal corrections has come and asked us questions about our program and how we do things. They chatted with our officers and said, I've never heard an officer speak about their work environment like this in a jail, that they actually enjoy it and they feel purpose and they're happy and they feel respected by the inmates that they're providing care to. But furthermore to that, we've got, I think, 6 alumni now that are working in community-based treatment. Anybody that leaves one of our therapeutic living units, we give them door-to-door transportation to the next level of care. We fill out those referrals, we do it hand in hand with them, asking them where do they want to go next, and whether it's a recovery community-based treatment center, supportive housing, whatever that looks like, how do we support you in getting there? And make sure that with those barriers that a lot of people know about, transportation is a huge one. So if we can knock those down, and there was also an experience we had where one of our alumni called into a treatment center and he was very transparent and honest about previous charges, and they said, we can't accept you because of this charge. And my response was, well, that charge is when you were 18 and you're 48 now. So I drove down to the treatment center because it was in Calgary, and I said, hey, can we have a conversation? And they're like, what? I'm like, well, this rule, where does it come from? How long has it been in place? When's the last time you reviewed it? Did you ask him about when the charge was? Did you ask any of those details, or did you just hear it and shut it down? Why are we creating more barriers for individuals rather than, like, he was honest and he was open about it? Did you ask enough questions? And they said, hey, I don't have the answers to that. I said, great, like I can hang out and wait, or if you want to email me back. It's great that, ministries, policymakers, that they've invited people and employed people that have that lived experience of trying to access different levels of care and been incarcerated, been in treatment centers, been to detoxes. They've invited them to come to the table and help them shape how systems should change to provide better access. That's phenomenal. But I said this in a workforce meeting with representatives from, Ministry, Recovery Alberta, other organizations. So there's also a piece on providers. I've also seen a system where publicly funded and private, where human beings are treated like resources because there's a feeling of scarcity for funding. a new operator's come in, or there's a new program and somebody goes, oh my God, this person's going to take our people and I'm going to lose my beds. And the reality of it is there's a whole lot of people to help. I was not a number, I'm a human being. So is every other person that's looking to access care. So that piece on operators and that responsibility from us to stop being so siloed, to ask questions, to open up doors, to try to do the right thing because it's a human being that's there that's trying to access help and receive care. That's the important part. If you do good work, people are going to come. I've got a firm belief in that. And there's also a piece of like that aspect of humility and curiosity. There's lots of what I know and even more of what I don't. I don't do everything great, nor do I want to do everything because there's too much to do. So I want to find out who those people are. I want to find out what they do, and I want to partner with them. I want to have those relationships. I want to have smooth transitions for individuals. That's the kind of space that I want to work in. Those are the kind of people that I want to collaborate with. I think that's my responsibility in the different roles that I'm in. When I go to these meetings, there's all these different providers, and some people don't like it, but I'm just going to call it what it is. I have lots of people that have said to me after the fact, I don't like that you said that. Well, that's a you thing. Look in the mirror, reflect on it. That's okay. If I'm not right, then hey, don't wear it. If I am right, let's have a conversation after the fact. Because I also know that I'm not perfect. And I appreciate when people give me feedback. So I want to be mindful of time for questions. I didn't get through all the slides, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity. I feel very nervous and very uncomfortable because I also know that I am on a university campus in a room full of very well-educated individuals, and I've said a lot of stuff here. If you do have questions, I hope I can answer them. If I don't have the answers, I'll make sure to take down your information so I can get back to you. But really, at the end of the day, I'm a human being that's constantly trying to learn and do better and help push change in any facet that can be to support individuals. So, thanks.